Ethan Carver wiped away the beads of sweat collecting on his forehead as he sifted through the cluttered attic of his suburban Chicago home. At 38, he still had the stamina to take on weekend projects like tackling this neglected space. "What's this?" he mumbled under his breath, pulling out a faded leather album hidden behind a pile of dusty magazines. He settled down on an old trunk, curiosity getting the better of him, and carefully flipped open the cover. A wave of nostalgia hit as he scanned through photos of his Irish-American family, each picture bringing back vivid memories. His gaze lingered on a recent family portrait. "Olivia's grown so much," he murmured, studying the features of his 14-year-old daughter. Something tugged at the back of his mind, though. Turning to a picture of himself from when he was the same age, Ethan started comparing the two. The differences were slight but unmistakable. Olivia's nose had a delicate curve his lacked, and although her eyes were the same blue as his, they had an almond shape that felt unfamiliar in his family lineage. Frowning, Ethan flipped to a photo of 12-year-old Noah. The boy's complexion was a shade darker than his own, his hair a richer, deeper brown. "It's probably nothing," he muttered, trying to brush off the nagging feeling that wouldn't leave him alone. But the more he stared at the photos, the more the doubt began to take root. Later that evening, after Olivia and Noah were tucked into bed, Ethan found himself alone in his dimly lit study, hunched over his laptop. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating, before he finally typed the words, "DNA test kits." "What are you up to, Ethan?" Melissa's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, wearing her usual curious expression. Snapping the laptop shut, Ethan forced a casual smile. "Oh, just looking up some resources for my history class," he lied, feeling a pang of guilt as the words left his mouth. "I'll head to bed soon." Melissa nodded, satisfied. "Don't stay up too late." "Good night, love." As she disappeared down the hall, Ethan reopened the laptop and placed an order for 3 DNA test kits. His hands trembled as he hit the "Confirm Purchase" button, his heart pounding as he wondered what truths those results might uncover. The following weeks felt endless. Each day dragged on as Ethan waited for the results, his thoughts consumed by the possibilities. At breakfast, he found himself scrutinizing his children's features, searching for connections to himself or Melissa. Finally, the email he'd been dreading arrived. With shaking hands, Ethan opened the attachment. His own results were as expected, an Irish and European mix. But Olivia and Noah's reports froze him in place. Both children had a significant percentage of Mexican heritage. "This can't be right," Ethan whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. That night, after hours of tossing and turning, he made up his mind. He needed answers, real answers. The next day, Ethan arranged to meet with a private investigator named Jack. Sitting across from Jack in a quiet, nondescript coffee shop, Ethan spoke in a hushed tone. "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful, and if she has, who it's with." Jack, a seasoned professional with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded and jotted down notes. "Do you have anyone in mind? Any suspicions?" Ethan shook his head. "None. But, the kids. They might not be mine." 2 weeks later, Jack called. "Mr. Carver, I think you should come to my office. There's something you'll want to see." Ethan's heart sank as he stared at the photos spread across Jack's desk. Melissa, his wife of 15 years, was in the arms of another man. A man with strikingly familiar features, ones that matched Olivia and Noah far too well. "His name's Carlos Ramirez," Jack explained. "He's Melissa's boss at the construction company. The affair's been going on for at least 15 years, before your marriage." Ethan felt his world tilt. 15 years. But we've only been married for. Jack nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carver. There's more." He slid a stack of papers across the desk, love letters, emails, hotel receipts, all proof of a long-standing and passionate affair. Ethan flipped through the evidence, his hands trembling. Every cherished moment, every family memory, felt tainted by this betrayal. Who is he? Ethan barely managed to ask. Jack sighed. Carlos Ramirez is a prominent figure in the construction industry around here. Known for his philanthropic work, and his Mexican heritage. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ethan's eyes fixated on the photo of Carlos Ramirez, unable to deny the resemblance between the man and his children. The curve of Olivia's nose, the deep brown of Noah's hair, it was all there. My whole life, it's been a lie, Ethan muttered, the words more for himself than for Jack, whose expression remained unreadable. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Ethan like a suffocating fog. Desperate for support, he decided to confide in his family, hoping they might provide some comfort or guidance. That Sunday afternoon, he gathered his parents and siblings at his childhood home, a place that once felt like a refuge. The familiar scent of his mother's apple pie wafted through the air, but instead of offering comfort, it churned his already unsettled stomach. I need to tell you all something, Ethan began, his voice trembling as he stood before them. Slowly, he unraveled the story, how he'd uncovered the photos, conducted the DNA tests, and finally, the crushing results delivered by the private investigator. As he spoke, a heavy silence settled over the room. His mother avoided his gaze, his father shifted uneasily in his chair, and his sister Emily exchanged a knowing glance with their brother James. A knot of anxiety tightened in Ethan's chest. What is it? He demanded, his voice edged with urgency. What aren't you telling me? Emily broke the silence first, her voice faltering. Ethan, we already knew. Her words landed like a gut punch. Ethan blinked, stunned. You knew? He repeated, his tone sharp with disbelief. What do you mean you knew? His father cleared his throat, his voice gruff. Son, we found out about Melissa's affair a few years ago. We thought it was better not to tell you. Better not to tell me. Ethan's voice rose, anger and shock battling for control. You let me live a lie. You let me raise children that aren't even mine, thinking they were. His mother reached out, her hand trembling. We thought we were protecting you, sweetheart. You seemed so happy. We didn't want to ruin that. Ethan recoiled from her touch, his face a mask of pain. Happy? I was ignorant. You let me walk around in the dark while you all knew the truth. James stepped in, his tone defensive. We didn't want to hurt you, man. We figured what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Not hurt me. Look at me now, James. You tell me this doesn't hurt. He stood abruptly, unable to stomach the sight of them any longer. The people he'd trusted most in the world, his own family, had betrayed him just as deeply as Melissa had. Ethan, please, his mother called after him, her voice pleading. We can work through this together. We can help you. He turned at the door, his face set in a grim expression. I don't need your help. I don't need any of you, he spat before stepping out into the fading sunlight. As Ethan drove home, the weight of his shattered world pressed down on him. His wife. His children. His family. Every pillar of trust in his life had crumbled. Alone in his car, a cold determination began to harden in his chest. If he couldn't rely on anyone else, then he would rely on himself. He would take back control of his life, no matter what it took. By the time he reached home, Ethan's mind was made up. He would get his revenge. The sun dipped below the horizon, marking the end of Ethan Carver's old life. In its place, a new Ethan emerged, one shaped by betrayal and determined to reclaim his fate. The following week, Ethan sat alone in his empty classroom, staring at the rows of unoccupied desks. The enormity of everything he'd uncovered weighed on him like an anchor. Sleep had become a luxury, with his nights consumed by restless thoughts and searing memories. He buried his face in his hands, trying to gather himself, when a knock at the door broke his solitude. "Got a minute, Ethan?" Principal Simmons asked as he stepped inside, his face grim. It wasn't really a question. Ethan gestured toward a student desk, and Simmons lowered himself into the small chair, which groaned under his weight. "There's no easy way to say this," Simmons began, looking unusually uncomfortable. "But the school board's finalizing a new history curriculum, and, well, it's not great." "What do you mean by not great?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. Simmons sighed, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase and placing it on the desk. "Take a look for yourself." Ethan flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with every page. The proposed changes weren't just not good, they were an outright whitewashing of history. Ethan slammed the folder shut, his jaw tightening. "This is unacceptable," he muttered under his breath, then glanced up, realizing who he was speaking to. "Sorry, I mean." But Simmons was already nodding in agreement. "You're right. It is unacceptable. Problem is, the board's under heavy pressure from some big donors. They're going to push this through, no matter what we say." A familiar anger stirred in Ethan's chest, the same slow-burning rage that had been building since the lies about his family came to light. But this time, the fury wasn't paralyzing, it was galvanizing. "No," he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "This is something we can fight. We have to fight." Simmons raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across his face. "We?" "Ethan, I sympathize, but my hands are tied here." "Forget the board," Ethan shot back, his tone unwavering. "These kids deserve better. They deserve the truth." For a moment, Simmons looked like he was about to argue, but instead, his shoulders slumped. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "But what can we do?" Ethan stood and began pacing the room, his thoughts sharper than they'd been in weeks. "We organize. Teachers, parents, students, anyone who'll listen. We make our voices impossible to ignore." As the words spilled out, an idea started taking shape. This wasn't just about stopping the curriculum changes, it was a way to channel all his frustration, all his pain, into something meaningful. Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into the fight with everything he had. He coordinated meetings, drafted petitions, and rallied support from every corner of the school community. His determination was relentless, his energy tireless. It was as if every ounce of hurt and betrayal had been transformed into a burning drive to make a difference. One evening, as Ethan was fine-tuning a presentation for an upcoming board meeting, Olivia peeked her head into his home office. "Dad," she said hesitantly, her voice soft. Ethan looked up from his laptop, guilt washing over him in waves. He realized just how much he'd been neglecting his kids lately. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Olivia perched on the edge of his desk, her legs swinging nervously. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted so badly to tell her the truth, to explain everything about Carlos, about Melissa, about the lies he'd uncovered. But as he looked into her concerned eyes, he couldn't bring himself to shatter her innocence. "I'm sorry, Liv," he said gently. "There's been a lot going on at school. But I promise, everything's going to be okay." Olivia nodded slowly, though she didn't seem fully convinced. "Is that why Mom's been crying at night?" Her question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He'd been so consumed by his own pain, and his crusade against the curriculum, that he hadn't even noticed Melissa's distress. I didn't know she'd been crying," he admitted quietly. "She tries to hide it," Olivia said with a shrug, "but I hear her sometimes." Ethan pulled his daughter into a hug, his mind racing. He had been so preoccupied with external battles that he'd lost sight of the turmoil unfolding within his own home. "I'll talk to her," he promised. "And I'm sorry I've been so distracted. How about we have a family game night tomorrow?" Olivia's face brightened instantly. "Really? Can we play Monopoly?" Ethan let out a rare laugh, the sound almost foreign to his own ears. Sure, kiddo. Monopoly it is. As Olivia bounded out of the room, Ethan turned back to his computer, the glow of the screen reflecting in his weary eyes. The fight against the curriculum changes was important, but his family mattered too. Even if the foundation of that family had been built on lies, they were still his family, and he had to figure out a way to strike a balance. And then, there was the question of what to do with the truth he carried like a weight on his back. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself walking a tightrope. By day, he was the passionate history teacher, rallying support and leading the charge against the board's proposed changes. By night, he was a man haunted by betrayal, consumed by thoughts of revenge. One evening, after tucking Olivia and Noah into bed, Ethan sat alone in his study. Around him, the desk was littered with financial records and legal documents. Jack, the private investigator, had come through with more than just proof of Melissa's affair. He'd uncovered something far bigger, evidence of financial misconduct at Carlos's construction company. Tax fraud, embezzlement, crimes that could topple Carlos's carefully crafted empire. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking expectantly. The decision lay before him. With a single keystroke, he could set in motion a chain of events that would destroy Carlos, and take back some measure of control over the chaos his life had become. With just a few clicks, Ethan could send an anonymous tip to the IRS. That single action would set off a chain reaction capable of dismantling Carlos's life piece by piece. But was that really what he wanted? He hesitated, his cursor hovering over the submit button. A soft knock at the door broke his train of thought. Melissa stood in the doorway, her expression heavy with concern. "Ethan, can we talk?" she asked quietly. He nodded, quickly minimizing the windows on his screen. Melissa stepped into the room, perching on the edge of his desk. Her eyes were rimmed red, evidence of tears shed in solitude. "I'm worried about you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so distant lately. Is it because of me?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a bitter laugh claw at his throat. If only she knew. "No," he lied, the word feeling sharp and bitter on his tongue. "It's just this issue with the school board. It's been taking up all my time." Melissa nodded slowly, but the doubt in her eyes was unmistakable. "I miss you," she murmured, her hand reaching out to touch his. For a fleeting moment, Ethan almost gave in. He nearly confessed everything, about Carlos, about the DNA results, about the mountain of evidence Jack had uncovered. But the image of those damning photos and the love letters flashed in his mind, hardening his resolve. 15 years of deception couldn't be brushed aside. He pulled his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said, avoiding her gaze. I need some space." Melissa's shoulders sagged, disappointment etched into her face. "Okay," she whispered before slipping out of the room. As the door clicked shut, Ethan turned back to his computer, his jaw set. The next day, he met with a divorce attorney. The attorney, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "So, Mr. Carver," he began, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" Ethan took a deep breath and laid it all out, the affair, the paternity of his children, even his family's complicity in keeping the secret. The attorney's face lit up with a predatory gleam. "This is gold," he said, practically rubbing his hands together. "We're going to take her for everything she's got." But Ethan shook his head firmly. "No. I don't want to hurt the kids. I just want justice." The attorney nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was hard to miss. "Fair enough. We'll do it your way. But in situations like this, it's best to strike hard and fast." As Ethan left the office, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirled in his chest. The wheels were officially in motion, and there was no turning back now. In the weeks that followed, Ethan moved methodically, with a precision that surprised even himself. He discreetly liquidated joint assets, transferring money into accounts only he could access. He meticulously compiled every piece of evidence Jack had gathered, creating an airtight case against both Melissa and Carlos. And then, late one night, when the house was silent and Melissa was asleep, Ethan made the call. His voice trembled as he reported the tax fraud at Carlos's company to the IRS, detailing every irregularity Jack had uncovered. But he forced himself to push through, refusing to let his nerves stop him. When he hung up, a strange cocktail of emotions washed over him. There was a surge of exhilaration, a feeling of satisfaction in finally taking control. But underneath it was a hollowness, a nagging doubt about whether this path of revenge would truly bring him peace. He shoved the doubts aside. He had come too far to stop now. The night of Carlos's company gala arrived, and Ethan found himself in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with unsteady hands. Melissa appeared behind him, radiant in a shimmering evening gown. Her reflection met his in the glass. "You look handsome," she said, her voice soft. Ethan forced a smile. "Thanks. You look beautiful." For a fleeting moment, he almost faltered. The woman in the mirror was the same one he had fallen for all those years ago. But the weight of the betrayal she carried snapped him back to reality, hardening his resolve once again. The gala was held in an opulent ballroom, its grand chandeliers casting a warm glow over the room. Chicago's construction elite mingled effortlessly, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. Ethan watched as Melissa worked the room with ease, laughing and chatting like the perfect corporate wife. She was in her element, completely at home in the spotlight. And then Ethan saw him, Carlos Ramirez. The man stood near the bar, dressed impeccably in a tailored tuxedo, exuding confidence as he held court with a small group of admirers. Ethan's fists clenched instinctively at his sides. This was the man who had stolen so much from him. The man who had fathered Olivia and Noah. The man who had shared his wife's bed for 15 years. As the night wore on, Ethan remained patient. He mingled just enough to blend in, made small talk with strangers, and sipped slowly from a single glass of whiskey. All the while, he waited for the right moment. Finally, it came. Carlos stepped up to the podium, his voice filling the grand ballroom with practiced charm and confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carlos began, his tone smooth and commanding, "I'm thrilled to announce that this year has been the most successful in Ramirez Construction's history. The future of our company has never been brighter." The room erupted in applause, the crowd eating up every word. Ethan saw his opportunity. Setting down his glass, he rose to his feet and strode toward the stage, his steps measured and deliberate. He could feel Melissa's eyes burning into him, her expression shifting between confusion and panic. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the applause like a razor. "I have something to add." Carlos hesitated, his confident smile faltering for the briefest moment before he recovered. "Of course, Ethan." He gestured toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Carver, the husband of our wonderful HR director, Melissa." Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been building toward. "Thank you, Carlos," he began, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on your incredible success. Truly, it's remarkable what you've built here." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the crowd. Melissa stood frozen near the back of the room, her face pale and stricken. Ethan's gaze returned to Carlos. "But," he continued, his tone hardening, "I think it's time for some honesty. Honesty about what this company is really built on." Reaching into his jacket, Ethan pulled out a folder. "I have here the results of DNA tests proving that Carlos Ramirez is the biological father of my children. I also have evidence of a 15-year affair between Carlos and my wife, Melissa." The room fell silent for a moment, before erupting into gasps and whispers. Carlos's face drained of color, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edges of the podium. But Ethan wasn't done. His voice rose above the growing commotion. And that's not all. I also have documents detailing years of tax fraud and embezzlement at Ramirez Construction. Those documents are already in the hands of the IRS and the FBI. Chaos erupted. Board members jumped to their feet, shouting questions. Investors scrambled for the exits, their voices buzzing with panic. In the eye of the storm stood Carlos and Melissa, their carefully curated worlds crumbling before everyone's eyes. Ethan watched as the owner of the company, his face twisted with rage, stormed up to Carlos. "You're fired," he bellowed. "And you'd better cooperate with every single part of this investigation." Melissa stumbled toward Ethan, her face streaked with tears. "Ethan," she sobbed, "how could you do this?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "How could I?" he asked quietly. "Melissa, how could you? 15 years of lies. Our entire marriage, it was nothing but a sham." As security began clearing the ballroom, Ethan turned and walked away. Behind him, he could hear Melissa's cries mingling with Carlos's desperate attempts to calm the furious board members. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Stepping outside, the crisp night air hit him like a slap. He loosened his tie and took a long, steadying breath. It was over. His revenge was complete. But as he stood there, watching the chaos unfold through the ballroom's windows, Ethan felt no satisfaction, no vindication. The fire of his anger had burned out, leaving nothing but a hollow ache in its place. He hailed a cab, giving the driver his home address. As the city lights blurred past the windows, Ethan's thoughts raced. He had torn down the facade of his old life, shattered the lies that had surrounded him. But now, he faced an even greater challenge, figuring out how to rebuild something real from the rubble. The morning after the gala, Ethan woke to a world irrevocably changed. The taste of victory was bitter on his tongue, mixed with the sour residue of spent rage and lingering heartbreak. He stared at the ceiling, his mind heavy with questions. Would the emptiness he felt ever be filled? Would this hollow victory ever feel like justice? His phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, vibrating with messages and calls. News of the gala's explosive confrontation had spread like wildfire through Chicago's business circles, lighting up every corner of the rumor mill. Ethan ignored the calls, silencing the device with a swipe of his hand. He wasn't ready to deal with the fallout, not yet. Instead, he focused on the next step in his meticulously crafted plan. His fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. At exactly 9 a.m., Ethan stepped into the sleek offices of Hartley and Associates, home to Chicago's most cutthroat divorce attorney. William Hartley's reputation was legendary, a predator in a legal field full of prey, known for leaving his opponents with little more than their dignity, if even that. Hartley's office screamed success. Rich mahogany furniture, buttery leather chairs, and a sprawling view of Lake Michigan that likely cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. The man himself was no less impressive, a tailored suit, a perfectly coiffed haircut, and eyes that gleamed with the cold hunger of someone who thrived on tearing others apart. "Mr. Carver," Hartley said smoothly, rising to shake Ethan's hand. "I heard about last night's performance. Quite the spectacle, if I may say so." Ethan gave a curt nod as he took a seat. "I want this handled quickly and cleanly," he said, pulling a thick folder from his bag. "Everything you need is right here." Hartley's eyes lit up as he opened the folder and began flipping through the evidence. "Oh, this is excellent. Very strong. With this, we can—" "No," Ethan cut him off, his voice firm. "I don't want to destroy her completely. I just want what's fair. And I want custody of the kids." Hartley's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Carver. We'll proceed exactly as you wish." Over the following weeks, Ethan's life became a blur of legal meetings and court appearances. Melissa, cornered by the mountain of evidence against her, put up little resistance. The strain showed on her face, her once flawless appearance was replaced by dark circles under her eyes and a defeated expression that seemed permanent. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it was swift and decisive. Ethan was granted full custody of Olivia and Noah, along with the lion's share of the marital assets. Melissa walked away with a modest alimony payment and limited visitation rights, more of a consolation prize than anything else. As Ethan exited the courthouse, he spotted Melissa sitting on a bench just outside. Her head was buried in her hands, her shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, a flicker of pity passed through him. Maybe even regret. But the memory of 15 years of lies and betrayal quickly extinguished those feelings. Without a word, he turned and walked away. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Carlos Ramirez's life was unraveling even faster. The IRS investigation, sparked by Ethan's anonymous tip, had unearthed years of tax fraud and embezzlement. Carlos's sterling reputation in the construction industry was now nothing but a cautionary tale. His assets were frozen, his contracts pulled, and his name was plastered across the headlines in disgrace. Desperate to salvage his crumbling life and cling to his opulent lifestyle, Carlos turned to gambling. At first, he kept it legitimate, frequenting high-end casinos. But as his losses mounted and his desperation deepened, he descended into the seedy world of Chicago's illegal gambling rings. One night, in the smoky backroom of a dilapidated bar, Carlos sat hunched over a poker table. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he clung to his last chip, having gambled away everything else, his savings, his home, and any chance of redemption in the construction world. All in, he croaked, pushing the final chip forward with trembling fingers. The dealer, a dead-eyed man with yellowed fingers, dealt the final card. Carlos's hand shook as he flipped over his cards. "House wins," the dealer said flatly, scooping up the pot. Carlos stumbled to his feet, the room spinning around him. In just a few short months, he'd fallen from one of Chicago's most respected businessmen to a broken man drowning in debt. Staggering out into the icy night, Carlos Ramirez realized his carefully built life of lies and deceit had collapsed into nothing. Across the city, Ethan Carver slept peacefully for the first time in months. His revenge was complete. The next morning, Ethan stood in his driveway, watching a realtor hammer foreclosure signs into the lawn of his family's former home. The sight stirred a strange mixture of emotions, satisfaction, grief, and a sense of finality. "Dad?" Olivia's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find her standing nearby, looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are we really leaving?" Olivia's voice pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He turned to his daughter and saw the blend of uncertainty and cautious hope in her eyes. At 14, Olivia was old enough to grasp the broad strokes of what had happened, though he'd spared her and Noah the more sordid details. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, pulling her into a hug. "It's time for a fresh start." Noah came bounding out of the house, his 12-year-old energy undiminished by the chaos of the past few months. "I call shotgun in the moving truck," he shouted, dashing past them toward the driveway. Ethan chuckled despite himself. The lies, the betrayal, the ugly spectacle of the divorce, it had all taken a toll. Yet his kids had displayed a resilience that amazed him every day. They'd chosen to stay with him, recognizing the steady love and support he had given them, even in the wake of the shocking revelation about their biological father. The move wasn't just about putting physical distance between them and the past. It was a chance to rebuild their lives, to create something unburdened by the weight of old deceptions. Ethan had accepted a job as principal at Oak Ridge Academy, a well-regarded private school known for its innovative approach to teaching history. As the moving truck pulled away from the driveway for the last time, Ethan caught a glimpse of their neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains. He imagined they were relieved to see the Carvers leave, tired of the scandal and whispers that had disrupted their quiet suburban street. The drive to their new home was a mix of Olivia and Noah's excited chatter and long stretches of contemplative silence. Ethan's thoughts drifted to the curriculum fight he had waged back in Chicago, a battle that had consumed him during some of his darkest days. That victory had earned him respect in educational circles and opened doors he never thought possible. As they crossed the state line, leaving the familiar skyline of Chicago behind, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The anger that had driven him for so long began to ebb, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Their new house was smaller than the one they'd left behind, but it felt brighter somehow. Sunlight streamed through large windows, bathing the rooms in warmth and promise. Olivia and Noah raced through the empty space, staking claims to bedrooms and arguing over closet space. Ethan stood in the living room, letting the quiet settle over him. This was a new chapter, and for the first time in months, it felt like a fresh start. The first few weeks in their new town were a blur of unpacking, preparing for the school year, and meeting the neighbors. Ethan poured himself into his new role at Oak Ridge Academy, determined to leave a positive mark on his students and the school community. But as life settled into a routine, Ethan realized that moving on wasn't enough. The betrayal he had endured had left deep scars, wounds that wouldn't heal without intentional effort. He needed to confront the pain, not just bury it. On a whim, Ethan decided to start a support group for people who had experienced betrayal in their marriages. The first meeting was held in a small room at the community center, with just 3 others in attendance. "My name is Ethan," he began, his voice unsteady, "and I'm here because my wife of 15 years had an affair with her boss. An affair that resulted in 2 children I believed were mine." As he spoke, Ethan felt an unexpected sense of relief. Sharing his story, voicing his truth to people who understood, was more cathartic than he had anticipated. Week by week, the group grew. People from all walks of life came together, bound by the common thread of betrayal. They shared their stories, offering each other strength and solace. For the first time in a long time, Ethan found a sense of purpose, helping others navigate the turbulent waters of broken trust and rebuilding their lives. It was during one of these meetings that Ethan first noticed Sophia. She sat quietly in the back of the room, her dark hair framing a face that seemed to hold both strength and vulnerability. When she finally spoke, her story of betrayal and resilience struck a chord with Ethan. After the meeting, Ethan and Sophia lingered, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Sophia, as it turned out, was also a history teacher at a nearby high school. "I've heard great things about what you're doing at Oak Ridge," she said, a spark of admiration lighting up her eyes. "Your approach to teaching history is inspiring." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. "Thank you," he replied earnestly. "It's been challenging, but it's the most rewarding work I've ever done." As weeks turned into months, their friendship grew deeper. They pushed each other intellectually, sharing ideas about education, social issues, and life itself. Sophia encouraged Ethan to push boundaries in his teaching, challenging him to think beyond traditional methods and inspiring him to embrace innovation. One evening, after a particularly animated discussion about the role of education in driving social change, they found themselves walking through a quiet park. The conversation waned, leaving a comfortable silence between them. Ethan suddenly realized something had shifted within him. The hollow ache he'd carried for so long had been replaced by something new, something hopeful. He turned to Sophia, and the same realization reflected in her eyes. Slowly, cautiously, they leaned toward each other. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, filled with promise. When they pulled apart, Ethan felt a whirlwind of emotions, excitement mixed with fear. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia squeezed his hand, her gaze steady in understanding. "That's okay," she said softly. "We've got time." For the first time in years, Ethan felt genuine hope for the future. 5 years passed in a blur of family milestones, school events, and quiet evenings shared with Sophia. Life had settled into a rhythm Ethan never thought possible after his divorce. Olivia, now 19, was thriving in her first year of college, her ambition and confidence shining. Noah, at 17, was making waves as the captain of his high school debate team, his quick wit and passion for justice a constant source of pride for Ethan. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan was in his office at Oak Ridge Academy, sifting through applications for a new history teacher position, when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't familiar, but something urged him to answer. "Hello," he said. "Ethan, it's Karen," a voice replied. "Melissa's sister." His stomach dropped. He hadn't heard from anyone in Melissa's family since the divorce. "Karen? What's wrong?" There was a pause, filled with static and unspoken words. "It's Melissa," Karen said, her voice trembling. "She's gone, Ethan. She passed away last night." The world seemed to tilt. Ethan gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. "What happened?" he managed to ask. "It was her heart," Karen said, her voice cracking. She went in her sleep." Karen continued, her words tumbling out in a mixture of grief and practicality, details about funeral arrangements, legal matters, and other loose ends. But Ethan found himself strangely detached. He felt no joy in Melissa's passing, but neither did he feel the crushing sorrow he might have once expected. It was as if she had become a distant figure from another life, a stranger he once knew. Then Karen's tone shifted, growing heavier with emotion. "Ethan, there's something else you need to know," she said. "Melissa, she's been struggling these past few years. After the divorce and everything with Carlos, she couldn't find work. The scandal followed her." Ethan listened silently as Karen described Melissa's decline. Unable to find a job in human resources or any corporate position, Melissa had been forced to take work as a janitor at a local community college. She lived in a rundown apartment, scraping by on meager wages. The once polished, composed woman Ethan had known had been reduced to a shadow of herself. "And Carlos?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself, though he wasn't sure why he cared. Karen let out a bitter laugh. "That man fled to Mexico about a year ago. Left her to deal with everything on her own. Rumor is he had gambling debts, big ones." When the call ended, Ethan sat alone in his office, the silence pressing in around him. He stared blankly at the papers on his desk, his mind reeling. He didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. What he felt was harder to name, an odd blend of pity, regret, and emptiness. The life Ethan had carefully built over the past 5 years suddenly felt fragile, as if the ghosts of his past could reach out and shatter it at any moment. That evening, he gathered Olivia and Noah in the living room. Sophia sat nearby, her quiet presence a steadying force. "Kids," Ethan began, his voice calm but heavy with emotion, "I have some news about your mom." He watched them closely as he spoke, ready to offer comfort or explanations if needed. Olivia and Noah, now young adults, absorbed the news with a maturity that both surprised and saddened him. "Do you think we should go to the funeral?" Olivia asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, seeing flickers of Melissa in her expression, the curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head. "That's something we need to decide together," he said gently. "It's okay if you want to go. It's also okay if you don't." They talked late into the evening, the conversation peppered with tears and quiet moments of reflection. In the end, they chose to attend the funeral, not out of obligation, Ethan realized, but as a way to find closure, to close the book on a chapter that had shaped all their lives. The day of the funeral arrived, gray and brisk, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the somber mood. Ethan stood between Olivia and Noah at the graveside, holding their hands tightly in his. The priest's voice carried through the still air, reciting final prayers. Ethan's mind wandered, reflecting on the twisted and painful path that had led them here. Yes, his quest for revenge had delivered a measure of justice. But standing there, watching his children say goodbye to a mother they barely knew, he realized that justice alone hadn't brought him happiness. That had come later, through resilience, through focusing on his children, and through rebuilding his life with integrity. As the service ended and the mourners began to disperse, Ethan squeezed his children's hands and turned toward them. He looked at Olivia and Noah, really looked at them, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Their life now was one of authenticity, free from the lies and betrayal that had once shadowed it. It was built on trust, honesty, and an unshakable love. They walked toward the parking lot, where Sophia waited by the car. Her presence was a reminder of the new chapter they were living, one centered on trust, choice, and the family they had created together. As they drove away from the cemetery, leaving behind the final physical tie to their old life, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of the journey. He had Olivia and Noah, he had Sophia, and he had a life grounded in truth. The ghosts of the past would always linger in the shadows of memory, but they no longer held power over him. Ethan Carver had faced his demons, endured the storm of betrayal, and emerged stronger for it. As the car merged onto the highway, heading home, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. Olivia and Noah sat in the back seat, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. He smiled, his chest swelling with a quiet certainty. Despite the pain, the heartache, and the trials, he wouldn't change a thing. Every hardship had shaped the life they now shared, a life bound not by blood or false promises, but by love, choice, and an unwavering commitment to honesty. The future stretched out before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with new memories, triumphs, and joy. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Carver was truly, deeply happy.